Thanks for listening to this Word in Your Ear podcast. If you'd like to get early access to all our productions ad-free, priority booking for our live events, and to take part in our weekly quiz, go to patreon.com/wordinyourear for more details.
You're listening to a podcast from The Word.
You know, they say that an elephant is a horse designed by committee. I think the list of names for the London Overground lines that were come up with yesterday were definitely arrived at by committee. And it's really interesting. They kind of kerfuffle on social media about this yesterday. There seemed to be two sides to this story. One was the kind of Daily Mail side of, working itself up into a rage about this as the political correctness gone mad. And then the opposition, who worked themselves up into an equal rage purely because the Daily Mail has got themselves in a rage. You know what I mean? There must be a good thing because the Daily Mail are against them. And the fascinating thing to me about the names is that however they're arrived at, they're crap names. They're just crap names. Nobody's ever going to call anything the Lioness Line.
The Lioness Line.
It doesn't.
Mild line, the Windrush Line. My local's now the Windrush Line.
Oh dear.
We'll be taking the Windrush tomorrow. We've Suffragette Line. It was a lovely tweet from our old pal Andrew Harrison about that. He said, taking the Suffragette line, said, don't lean on me, man. I can't afford a ticket.
Can't afford the ticket. And because I was thinking that all these lines could have musical associations, historical musical associations. And so I've come up with some.
Oh, this is good. Go on.
That is my alternative. Now, the Lioness Line, we all know goes from Euston to Watford Junction. So the young Elton used to take this, to go and see Watford. I was watching an interview the other day. We were talking about it. So obviously, the Elton Line just works, doesn't it?
Perfect. It is.
And you take the line,
and you feel better for being on it too.
Absolutely. You take the Mildmay line, which is from Stratford to Richmond. That is the line that the young Andrew Luke Oldham took from his mother's place in Hampstead Heath when he went over to Richmond and first saw the Rolling Stones.
Fantastic.
You could go Stones lines, I suppose. The Mick line somehow feels right.
Yeah.
The Mick line. The Windrush line is Highbury and Clapham Junction to West Croydon. And so who do we associate with Croydon? Who started her career in Croydon? Kirsty McCall. The Kirsty line. That works.
Line.
It works. The Weaver line goes from Liverpool Street to Cheshunt. Now, there's two alternatives here, because Cheshunt was where Cliff Richard first came from, and so Move It, his first hit, was written when somebody was stuck on a bus outside Cheshunt, intriguingly enough. So you could call it the Cliff Line, but because it goes through White Hart Lane Station, I feel you've been missing an opportunity if you didn't call it the White Hart Line. I feel absolutely everybody in London would agree on that.
That seems reasonable. It's a little bit Spurs-centric, but
absolutely. The Suffragette line goes from Gospel Oak to Barking, and so the Bragg Line, the Billy Bragg Line.
Yes, the Bragg Line.
And the Liberty Line finally goes from Romford to Upminster, so the Dury Line. The Upminster kid, Ian Dury.
Yes.
So if anybody's got better ideas than that, well, keep it to yourself.
Those are superb. You're a bit late, Dave. To announce that the day after it's been decided. You could have been in the running.
The Word Podcast. Prime cuts of popular culture served fresh each week.
Very, very sad news about Steve Wright last week. And it was just interesting seeing the enormous response from people comedians actually, a lot of the comedians talking about how influential he was. Charlie Higson talking about how the characters from the Fast show, a lot of them were kind of based on ideas from his show, Rob Brydon and various people. But I thought one of the interesting things was the technicalities of what he did. Danny Baker had tweeted a thing saying, to work the radio, to master and elevate radio, to play with and extend the possibilities of radio, that is the trick. And I thought that was interesting because I remember, and you do too, working at Radio 1 on various things at the time, in the 80s when Steve Wright's show was really taking off. And what I remember was that people like Bates, I stood in for somebody before Bates once. I can remember Bates used to arrive literally about 5 minutes before the programme. All the stuff was in the box, and there were the records he was going to play, with a few notes from the producer about things he might say or gigs he could mention or whatever. And he left about 10 minutes after. Steve Wright used to arrive at about 9 o'clock in the morning and work all day.
He did.
And all up until the point where he broadcast at 4 o'clock, but all day, not on to that day's programme, on the next day's programme.
And listen, so he did that, because I used to see when I used to do the things with Johnny Walker, 5 years ago or whatever, at Wogan House, and he was always there. Steve Wright just lived there, he just worked on that stuff. Every hour that God sent, he worked on that stuff. So it wasn't a case of, that when he did it, having done it 30, 40 years, he felt he could wing it. He didn't at all.
No, not remotely.
He absolutely put himself into it.
And his whole thing was preparing those packages. As you remember, the show some of it was live, obviously, and it was him just introducing music and just filling and doing links and stuff. But a lot of it was those packages with his gang. You remember Mr. Angry and all those guys, and the pretentious music critic. And they were really funny. It was kind of anti-woke before woke was invented, wasn't it? Do you remember the pretentious music critic? It always used to talk about sonic cathedrals of sound. Really good. And there was a kind of ineffectual social worker. Just brilliant characters. But I mean, all that stuff was put together as pre-records, wasn't it? And I remember when we were talking to our old pal Trevor Dan about him, he was saying that Steve Wright hated breathing. He hated any gaps at all.
Yeah.
And he would record an interview, even with somebody promoting a book or a film or whatever. He would pre-record that, so all the tiny little gaps could be taken out, so it moved this incredible pace. And that was really interesting. I was trying to think where everyone always talks about zoo radio, but actually his format in some ways was a bit like Rowan and Martin's Laughing, which you and I are just about old enough to remember, wasn't it? Where you have a central host and then you just have a range of standard characters who come in with their one-liners. And it was kind of catchphrase radio, wasn't it, before anyone else was really kind of doing that. But he was working on all sorts of other things at the time. Wasn't they developing something at Radio 2, weren't they?
Well, I mean, who knows? I mean, there's been the usual speculation in the press about fallings out at Radio 2 and so forth over the years. I mean, it was undoubtedly the case that Radio 2 moved him from the afternoon slot, what was it, just over a year ago or something. That's when we had Trevor in on the podcast. Talking about what made him remarkable, what made Steve Wright remarkable as a broadcaster. And subsequently, he carried on doing the weekly, his love songs thing, and that was just a weekly thing. But Radio 2 are now having, it seems from the outside, now having, pensioned off a load of older presenters in order to get younger ones in there. Feel that they have to somehow get the elder ones back to do some kind of ancillary service, to still play Build Me Up Buttercup by the Foundations or whatever, alongside the latest Taylor Swift record. And so...
Well, that's the threat of Greatest Hits Radio, presumably to some extent, isn't it?
Well, not just
Ken Bruce and Sam Mayer.
But it's also Boom Radio. They've definitely left their flank uncovered. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
Yeah.
Radio 2. And of course, Radio 2 draws itself up to its full height, in cases like this. And the natural reaction is people say, but didn't you get rid of this guy? Didn't you move him on, And Steve
Wright
did
exactly to Radio 2 what they did to Radio 1 back in the late 90s.
Well, okay. But I say with Radio 2, I do think it's kind of interesting that all the kind of radio heads have been moved on. You know what I mean? And Steve Wright was, he'd be the first one to say himself, great face for radio. That's what he did. He did radio. Whereas radio, if you look at Radio 2 schedules nowadays, entirely dominated by TV faces. That's how you get hired at Radio 2. You become famous through TV, or I don't know, it'll move on from TV, so it'll be YouTube, or it'll be a social media influencer or whatever, you're highly unlikely to come up through radio the way that Steve Wright did.
I was just looking at the various people on Radio 2 at the moment. Rob Beckett, Ryland Clark, Natalie Appleton, Rick Astley, Kat Deely, Gabby Logan, Alex Jones. Your point entirely.
There you go.
All of them TV stars.
That's
guaranteed, supposedly, to bring some kind of constituency with them.
And I think it's sort of, well, I don't think that's proven myself. I don't either. I can see why the people who run radio stations do it. But I don't think it's entirely proven. And if Steve Wright is the kind of last of the radio people, although, as to be fair, you could say people like Chris Evans are the same thing, I think the great thing about genuine radio stars, and Steve Wright and Chris Evans and John Peel and, I don't know, Emperor Roscoe and all kinds of people you can think of, is there was a little bit of them that was slightly mad.
Yes. There
was just something that was slightly unbalanced.
Yeah.
And that's great.
It is.
You replace them with TV people. TV people are just different. TV people are only bothered about one thing, which is being on television.
TV people are also far more self-conscious. They're far more, they're obsessed with how their image and whether or not they're doing anything that might affect that. Radio people have none of that. They just have that freedom to go off at tangents, any direction at all, and just experiment.
Well, I've always felt that all the big radio stars I've known, they've all slightly screwed.
Slightly bonkers.
That's right, slightly bonkers.
But is that kind of radio still going on? That idea that things that Steve Wright did, which were, incredibly creative. As I say, all those characters that he brought on that influenced the start of Stella Street and Fast Show and all that, And I was looking at people like Danny Baker and Chris Morris. And Danny Baker, doing radio with no scripts, his improvisation, his idea of riffs where the show was built about interaction with the audience. Oh, we're doing, unusual instruments on pop records. People would ring up saying, I found this is the trouser press being played on a track with a Bonzo Dog Doodah. And also Chris Morris, that psychedelic whimsy and those spoof phone calls and his invented news bulletins, all that eventually, started on the hour and brass eye in the day-to-day. I mean, is there anybody making that kind of radio? I don't really know. That's slightly different, I know, from a music-based format where you're meant to be playing pop music the whole time. But, I mean, is there anyone doing that? Or has that creatively moved somewhere else?
I think it probably has moved somewhere else because, back in the day, if you wanted to start a kind of riff going about odd instruments played on records, for instance, radio was the place to do it. Nowadays, you've got social media. It's the place to do it. And so if you were a kind of Phil Cornwell figure starting up now, you'd be on Instagram, wouldn't you? You'd be on YouTube. You'd just do what you did. You wouldn't wait to be hired by somebody. You'd get out there and do it yourself, It's a different world.
This is a junction in the word podcast. It separates that bit from this next bit.
And connecting with that, I don't know if you saw the story about Tommy Vance. Really interested me. We were talking about boom radio. Boom radio is a kind of it's for the baby boom generation, and so it's presumably somewhere where you can still hear the big hits of the 70s.
You can hear "Build Me Up, Buttercup" by the Foundation.
I'm sure you can.
You can, and there's nothing wrong with that. Listen, and it was launched about 2 years ago, and it's been enormously successful.
Yeah,
and it's got all your old favorites. I don't know, you might reads and so forth, and they're all pretty much broadcasting from their bedrooms at home. Because these people want to be on the radio.
And Nicky Horn's there, isn't he? I think people like that.
And they've done really well out of it, and they've clearly put the wind up Radio 2.
Oh, completely.
There's no doubt about that.
Oh, yeah.
So anyway,
but I noticed the story that they were saying that they were bringing back Tommy Vance. Now, obviously, Tommy Vance, as we know, Tommy Vance died 20 years ago. But what they're doing is using AI to feeding into AI a load of recordings of Tommy Vance, and thus being able to produce links. I mean, I don't know. Tommy Vance was broadly about a kind of a vocal texture, wasn't he? That lent itself to denim aftershave and stuff like that. But and it was also slightly catchphrases, wasn't he? So I can see why it's possible to do that. They have already constructed Tommy Vance saying, "Rock, that's why we're here." So it's things like that. Did
you ever see Tommy in the studio doing that?
Oh yeah, I did.
He used it. I'm going to attempt to do this with my microphone now. I'm talking quite close to the microphone. I'm a couple of inches away from it. Tommy would literally touch the microphone with his lips and talk like this with his unbelievable voice.
Yeah,
and the thing that Tommy
called himself the larynx on legs.
Larynx on legs.
With the TV on the radio.
TV.
You're right. You just have to lean into the mic, don't you?
Yeah.
And you suddenly sound like Tommy Vance.
But the great thing Tommy had was his utter commitment to whatever he was going to say. It could be absolute gobbledygook. It wouldn't matter. He would say it as if it was as if it had been handed down to him from Mount Olympus. That's what he did. So, Boom Radio, I've got him saying, "Rock."
That's right.
That's why we're here. And it worked. Hey, listen, Tommy, I think Orion's saying, nobody will be more delighted than Tommy to feel that his voice was, continuing even after he was no longer here. He would be absolutely thrilled.
He'd be absolutely thrilled.
Did I tell you my favourite Tommy Vance story? I worked with Tommy many times. He was always wearing a leather jacket, wasn't he? He was wearing a leather blouson and shades, wasn't he? Never seen it.
Probably with maybe something like Camel on the back or whatever. Yeah, go on.
We were. I was in Memphis, Tennessee when we went with VH1 and we did a week's worth of programs. And Tommy used to do the rock show on VH1. So Tommy was obviously there. And everybody else was, zipping about doing loads of different things, interviewing people and, doing remotes and all kinds of things. But Tommy just did what Tommy did. He didn't do anything else, And we were staying in the Peabody Hotel, which is a splendid old hotel in Memphis. And I was sitting in the reception one day with Genevieve Lewis, who Genevieve was producer. And I said, "Where's Tommy?" And she says, "Oh, Tommy doesn't do anything before midday." And while we were
crack of noon.
No, listen. While we were sitting there, I heard a ding to announce that the elevator had just landed on that floor. The doors open. Out came Tommy. Shades, leather blouson. And I looked at the clock. 12 o'clock.
12 o'clock.
Ding!
12 o'clock rock.
That's when he came.
So it's a rich source of stories, that trip, because only last week you were talking about, or the other week you were talking about Paul King and his sarong.
Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah.
But all that links slightly into the idea of actors' voices being kept permanently alive.
Well, that's the
thing.
thing.
On doing voiceovers, because you're constantly listening to audio versions of books or whatever, and they're read by people who, some of whom died a while ago, but they're still,
If you listen to Radio 4 Extra or those things, you're settling in to listen to some old Jeeves and Wooster, where Jeeves is played by Richard Bryars. Jeeves is played by Michael Hordern, and Bertie Wooster is played by Richard Bryars. And you realise that they both joined the Choir Invisible many years ago. But their voices can just go on and on and on because, old sound doesn't date, does it really?
No,
there's a limit to how long you can run old TV programs. But old radio programs you can go on with forever. And I happened to be listening to an audio book the other day and thought, God, this is well read. This is really good. And I looked in it. I think it was Michael Wood or whatever, the actor. And I thought, I wonder if he's still with us. And I looked him up. He'd been dead 20 years. And I didn't know how I felt about that, really, that I'd been walking about having a kind of relationship with the person who was dead, you know?
Yeah.
Because I was spending hours a day pretty much listening to this one person read this, you know, quite demanding book. But I'm sure he'd be thrilled to know that it was still going on.
And talking of the old guard, the story about Eric Idle.
Oh, God, yeah.
Did you follow that? It was really interesting because Eric Idle simultaneously bleating about the fact that at the age of 81, he still has to work, and then sounding incredibly disappointed that Monty Python isn't still earning him money. I mean, I couldn't really understand that. I mean, the way Monty Python would still earn money would be that they'd be touring or something like that. There'd be tickets they could sell on the back of it, which they're not doing. It would be still selling vast quantities of records, but obviously it isn't, because the people who have those records have already got them, and I don't think Monty Python is in any way in the frame anymore. It doesn't seem remotely fashionable or hit, does it, with anybody under 60? Does anyone under 60 really care about Monty Python? I don't know. And even those over 60 kind of think that it's now a bit dated, you know. And also there'd be the movies. I mean, the movies, some of which, Life of Brian particularly, are still really good. And there would be some kind of revenue in them being streamed. But the idea that Monty Python itself is still producing a large amount of money for the people who worked on it is preposterous, don't you think? Who would have thought that?
And it seemed a bit odd to me that I think he was responding to the fact, the understandable thing that a lot of people will probably think, oh, he's Eric Idle. He's very famous, therefore he's got a huge, great bank vault full of cash, which cannot be the case, you know what I mean? Because you don't know how much people earn, you know. People invest money, they lose money. Some people do well out of things, some people do less well out of things. And also in the case of Monty Python, there were a load of them. You know, there were... How many of them were there?
No, well, there were six originally.
6 of them.
Yeah.
6 of them, so whatever it was shared between the 6 of them. And, you know, Michael Palin went on to have a totally, probably a bigger career as a best-selling author and TV presenter. And John Cleese has frantically done things, you know, and had to keep working largely because of the number of wives that he appears to have gone through.
I know. And he's always desperately trying to kind of revive Fawlty Towers and stuff, and it doesn't seem quite right. Really.
But clearly what is annoying Eric Idle is that the Python company is now run by Terry Gilliam's daughter. And so he was quite on social media saying that, you know, that he'd been badly let down by that. And Cleese actually responded on social media. Oh, yeah,
Cleese on behalf of him and
Palin and whatever. That this woman they have no criticism of this person at all. And of course, Cleese has got the Fawlty Towers running in the West End, hasn't he?
That's right, yes.
Just, I think, has it open?
Cleese rather sadly also tweeted that he and Eric Idle had always loathed and detested each other, which I thought was really sad, actually. It's sad that he'd said that. I didn't want to know that, actually.
But Eric Idle, I tell you, I met Eric Idle.
You did when you were interviewing Jagger, wasn't it?
I was in Barbados.
Yeah.
I was in Barbados interviewing Mick Jagger for Whistle Test. We're wandering around Barbados filming. And I think Jagger brought Eric Idle along because he was a house guest or something. I think he keep him amused during the day, bring Eric Idle along. So this would be whenever...
Like a court jester.
Yeah, a bit of that. And this would be 86. Is this 86? I think
yeah, it'd be about that, yeah.
And I remember thinking at the time, I wonder how Eric Idle makes a living. And that's 1986, Mark.
Yeah.
That's 40 years ago.
There was a bit of Spam-A-Lot, but that didn't last forever, did it?
Well, none of those things last forever. You know, you've no way of guaranteeing. Oh, and it's interesting. Take somebody else from the same generation. I think I sent you this thing. Tony Blackburn.
Yeah.
Tony Blackburn has just announced that he's quit his local radio show because obviously he doesn't have time to do it because he's doing, you know, whatever he does on Radio 2. He's doing his live show this, that, and the other. The new Radio 2 digital service is probably going to use him and so forth. And so Tony Blackburn, at the age of whatever, clearly gets up in the morning and works every bit as hard as he ever did. That's how people, that's how people keep the wolf from the door, isn't it, really, in those kind of positions? He's not sitting there expecting, to live on the kind of, on the revenue from radio he did 30 years earlier, And it could be that in future, fewer and fewer people will do that anyway, you know what I mean? Because the shape of the business will change in all kinds of ways. And then everybody will just keep on working for as long as they can, because obviously life expectancy is a lot different now than it was in the days when people, aimed everything towards the pension at the age of 65.
The Word Podcast, 2 cocoa tins and a piece of string.
So talking of the length of time of careers, a couple of things. If I were to read out to you this line, would you be able to place it? Pop picking is a fast and furious
business
these days, whether you're on the recording studio side listening out or on the disc counter side listening in. Do you know where that comes from?
I thought it was from the back of a Beatles.
It's the sleeve notes of the first Beatles album.
It is, that's right.
So it is. 1963.
Yeah.
Pop picking is a fast and furious business. So that's 1963. And we like to think everything's moved really quickly. Did you see, sorry, I'm going to explain this in a moment. Did you see Taylor Swift at the Super Bowl, turning out at the Super Bowl?
Oh, yeah.
Flew back from Japan to be with the boyfriend and so forth and be in America's Eye Line again, flew back overnight from Japan to be there. And apparently Kanye West, with whom she had arguments years ago, and a new album out. And so he too wanted to be at the Super Bowl and wanted to get as much attention as possible towards his new album. So he turned up at the Super Bowl in a Kanye West mask, which had the logo of his new album on the front of it, and booked a kind of box right in front of Taylor Swift's box at the Super Bowl, purely in order to get the attention when the camera moved to Taylor Swift. I thought, how are the mighty fallen?
That is desperate.
You have to do that. So he started doing this.
That's pitiful, isn't it? It's like positioning yourself like an advertising hoarding, isn't it? Where the cameras will pick you up.
Absolutely. And so the story goes that Taylor took umbrage at this and made a couple of phone calls, and he was moved. He was taken out of the stadium on her orders. That's the power of Taylor Swift.
That's superb.
He argues about whether this was the case or not. But anyway, the point of this story, Mark, is they have had a beef, as I believe the young people call it nowadays, since he interrupted her presentation of an award at the Video Music Awards. Okay? Do you remember this?
Yeah, I do. And it was a big moment for her, and he said, you shouldn't be getting this. Somebody else should.
Beyonce should be getting that.
Beyonce, wasn't it? That's right, yeah.
Okay. How long ago was that?
It must have been about 10 years ago.
15 years ago. Pop picking, no longer a fast and furious business. Taylor Swift has been at the top of the tree for more than 15 years, Mark.
Yeah.
Nobody used to be at the top of the tree for that long at all. Didn't apply. It's a totally different shape, isn't it, nowadays?
It is.
Absolutely extraordinary.
The Word Podcast. Clearly, there is no plan.
We recorded just the other day he's a member of Gallon Drunk, actually. He's a musician, but also author, Max Tishane, who's written this great book about teddy boys.
Yeah.
And I was just having an email exchange with him afterwards. He sent me a picture of himself with Spider Stacey from the Pogues. And he'd been to Cosimo Matassa's studio which is where Little Richard made his early hits.
New Orleans.
Rip It Up and stuff. I think Tutti Frutti was made there, actually, wasn't it? That's right.
Yeah.
And it's now a launderette with a little jukebox in the corner and a little plaque on the wall saying this is where, Tutti Frutti was recorded. Just a lovely idea. So it's now a launderette. I thought it was quite interesting. I was just having a look at which studios were still where. Olympic, who's just around the corner from where I live here, actually, is now a cinema.
Because that's what it was. That's what it was.
Yeah.
Before it was a studio.
Yeah.
Which is something it has in common with Stax in Memphis. Yeah. That was also formerly a cinema. And that's why it's interesting if you see photographs very often of Stax sessions from the 60s. The floor is sloping, raked, as they say in the theatre, because you used to have seating on it, And so, very often they return to their original purpose, don't they? Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating how they change. Certain studios,
Townhouse Studios flats, I think. Motown and RCA Nashville are museums. I mean, you can tour around them. Bearsville, I think, is a theatre complex. But it's also interesting. Quite a lot of these are still going. Hansa is still going. Electric Lady, I didn't know that. Electric Lady is still going. Abbey Road, obviously. Muscle Shoals, Capitol, Rack, Metropolis. Quite interesting, really.
Well, they're with different specialisms. I think Trident in St Anne's Court in Soho is still there, but it's kind of mainly post-production for telly and films and so forth. Metropolis, which is that huge Art Deco building, isn't it?
Yeah, in Chiswick.
In Chiswick. There's probably a lot of mastering and things like that go on in there. Rack in St John's Wood High Street has been there for a long time and is still a very popular studio, which is not far from Abbey Road. And but things like Electric Lady in New York, and I think they were refinanced not long ago.
I think they kind of got a bit dilapidated and were rebooted.
Absolutely. I think it's a very difficult business. But there are still a few, but it's nothing compared to the hundreds that used to be there. But yes, go to Cozy Matassa's studio and get your socks washed.
The Word Podcast, driving the digital kids to school since 2007.
You were talking the other day about spending the day with your 6-year-old granddaughters and what you learned about the pop music process.
Yeah, it's half term, so we had them, and we were planning to go into town. Actually, this is classic. Wife and I said, "We'll take them into town. We'll take them to the National Gallery. Just show them some big pictures or whatever. That'll occupy a couple of hours or whatever." And they arrived, first thing in the morning, and we said, "We're going to go out." They said, "No, we want to play Strictly. We want to play Strictly." And so they arrived with full changes of clothing to 2 6-year-old granddaughters. And
what does that mean, playing Strictly? It's a game they've invented, or is it?
It's largely what they've invented. So basically, they put on clothes and they want to hear Strictly music. So they play Strictly music, Grandpa. Play Strictly music. What is Strictly music? Interesting question. So you go and look on Spotify, and you go and look on Strictly playlists. And what you find, Mark, and this is what I learned about pop music, is that all music is Strictly music nowadays. So basically, Strictly Come Dancing, which is a popular television program, Mark, goes on Saturday nights. And all the kids are loving it. And it involves, celebrities and professional dancers doing dance routines to popular music hits. Not
on the side of the street, Run Around Sue.
That's the point.
Putting on the Ritz
of all eras. And so, they will be playing hip hop hits, and they'll be playing Flip, Flop and Fly, and they'll be playing Putting on the Ritz, as you say it, and they'll be playing Beatles songs or Motown songs or Human League songs or absolutely anything. And so as far as my 6-year-old granddaughters are concerned, that's Strictly music. And so I thought it was really interesting.
That is interesting.
That if you'd said to them, I think what I'm about to say is literally true. I don't think my 6-year-old granddaughters know what a radio is.
Why would they? It's true.
There is not a device that they would identify as a radio. They expect, quite reasonably, all music to just appear, come into the air wherever they are, on the instructions of an adult. And so Grandpa plays Strictly music, and I sit there and get my phone out, and then there's a Bluetooth speaker in wherever you are, and next thing you know, you're listening to, I don't know what, Yazoo, or, Grandmaster Flash, or Elvis Presley, or absolutely anything in between, wherever you are. Where the box it came from is neither here nor there. You know what I mean? It's just the assumption that you can listen to anything, anywhere.
Yeah.
They've just grown up with that.
And it's interesting that it's such a broad range of stuff, isn't it? The idea that they're thinking that pop music does include putting on the Ritz and Run Around Sue.
Of course it is, yeah.
And as much as you say, Grandmaster Flash, I'm making that sound that's meant to be contemporary. That was 40 years ago.
Yes.
Incredible.
It is. And of course, they then dress up and, fling themselves around the living rooms to, some kind of activity that is a cross between dancing and all-in wrestling. And my wife and I sit on like a pair of chairs, pretending to be the judges. And then at the end of their routine, in inverted commas, we hold up little paddles with the score on them.
Oh, that's brilliant.
Which they got given for Christmas, So
do you have to diplomatically make sure that those scores are balanced each time?
Of course.
These are twin girls, after all.
Of course we do.
Yeah.
So,
But the winners are...
the same as... Can you come back next week?
Yes.
So that's it. That's what I learned from my granddaughters. All pop music is Strictly. Strictly is all pop music nowadays.
The Word Podcast. What's wrong with being sexy?
And we've just been joined by our producer, Alex. I'm sure you're both following the story of McCartney's bass, which is riveting. It was just updated very interestingly this morning on the Today programme, I thought, this being Friday the 16th when we're recording. And it's clear now that this Hofner bass that he bought in Germany in 1961 for, I think, 30 quid, a lot of money, was stolen from the back of the Wings van in 1972 that was parked in Ladbroke Grove. And that McCartney, the roadie who was in charge of it, went to the police and said it had been stolen. And this story got into the Evening Standard. And the guy who'd stolen it had no idea what he'd stolen and realised he had McCartney's bass, which was too hot to handle, took it up the road to the Admiral Blake pub and gave it to the landlord and said, "Can you possibly hide this for me?" And that throughout all their, investigations, they eventually went round, tracked down the people. The Admiral Blake, incidentally, was knocked down in 2002. So it must have been transported to another house. But in the attic of the house that did once belong to the landlord, there was the bass. And it's been returned to McCartney. I thought it was just an interesting story. Because it's supposedly worth £10 million. I'm sure it is worth £10 million. But the thing is, you can't sell it. It's like a stolen Picasso or something, isn't it? That, you could only sell that to somebody who was going to keep it in some kind of a temperature-controlled room somewhere. And after dinner with a glass of brandy, might show a few mates that he'd got it. But otherwise, what else are you going to do with it?
So, Alex, has any one musician been so uniquely identified with one particular style of instrument as Paul McCartney has with the Hofner violin bass? It seems to me there isn't.
I don't think there's anybody on the planet or any other instrument, actually. I mean, you get certain instruments which are associated with a genre. So you've got like a flying V guitar or whatever, that you see one of those things. And you just think rock in general as a concept. But the Hofner violin bass is an extension of Paul McCartney's body. And to the point where you see anybody else playing it, you just think, oh, they're
doing Paul McCartney.
That's somebody ripping off Paul McCartney. They're in a tribute band, yeah.
It's intrinsically tied to him, and it forever will be, I think. And I don't think there's no other instrument on the planet that has that has that tie to any particular individual. I don't think it will happen again, because I suppose at that time as well, electric guitars in general were a kind of a new concept.
Yeah, they were.
We don't have that benefit of like novelty in all senses now to really theme it in the same way. Somebody brings a new guitar out and somebody starts using it. It's not really a big thing anymore. Whereas, that was just it was new, and it was also all encompassing as well. But yeah, it's fascinating. Really, you almost don't see the guitar. You almost just see Paul McCartney's head with a neck on.
It's true. That's true. I do like the idea of people who steal things and end up stealing far more than they intended to. The same thing happened to the great train robbers, didn't it?
They didn't realise how much money they were going to get.
And it's a huge problem.
Yeah.
If you steal £500,000, relatively easy to get rid of. You steal 3 million, big problem, huge problem. It happens absolutely all the time. Alex, while you're here, our rock correspondent, there's something been puzzling me. I read that Pearl Jam are due to play the Tottenham Stadium, subject close to my heart, capacity over 62,000. Now, in my head, Pearl Jam are kind of middling successful. And I couldn't believe that however many years since the zenith of their career, which I always think is 30 years ago in the early 90s, that they can still sell that many tickets in London. Did it surprise you?
In a world where Shed 7 can now sell out an arena, nothing is impossible.
Can they?
The thing about Pearl Jam and grunge in particular is the Dripdown is massive. Now, they might have been a middling grunge band, sub Nirvana when they first dropped, as the kids say. But, the thing is, all those grunge kids now are dads. And now, because of course it's okay to like the music your parents like, because the parents you music like were the rock bands that were cool in the 90s. They're all going with their sons. And also the legend of the things got bigger because they visibly influenced so many groups and are still around. There's I suppose, kind of an air of relevancy to them too. I mean, they've never really gone away. Eddie Vedder's still knocking about, And I was in Seattle last month, and we went to the Museum of Popular Culture, and of course, they're from that sort of neck of the woods. But there's a whole room, for example, a whole exhibition dedicated to Nirvana. The whole thing is absolutely huge because now it's seen through the looking glass of, as being a seismic cultural revolution or movement. In the way it probably wasn't when it was happening, because it was just happening. It was just a pop thing that was happening. But, people look back on it 30 years later.
But that's always the case, though, isn't it? That you never appreciate at the time how big this thing's going to become or what it's going to represent.
No, I think you're right. And I think the same sort of things happen to Britpop in a way. Whether it's as big as grunge was is arguable. Maybe not, because I suppose it's a particularly British concept, whereas grunge, grunge is quite a universal thing. But all those bands, they're bigger than they ever were, and and also I think that the fact that Dave Grohl is probably the world's biggest rock star has not harmed that at all.
I suppose they also benefit from the fact that Nirvana are not around.
Yeah,
so,
anybody who broadly approves of the idea of grunge would want to go and attend that, wouldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you're just part of the whole movement. It's not specifically about Pearl Jam. Really.
But is it also the case that there's an economic factor behind this? Because if fathers are taking their sons or daughters to these things because they like the same music, they're also supplying the money to do it. So if it was left to the 18-year-olds of the nation, they wouldn't be paying whatever you'd have to pay to go and see Pearl Jam at the Spurs Stadium. Because it's too much money. Father pays it. So it's like taking your children on holiday now.
Father pays it and also equips you with a pair of huge knee-length baggy shorts to wear.
That's another thing, because all those grunge kids now, all those ex-stoners, have got careers and houses and nice cars and cash to burn. The paradigm's completely changed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
The Word Podcast. Fix yourself a drink and it's like being in the pub.
And we're joined by a very loyal supporter of our various enterprises, Nick Foreman. Nick, lovely to see you and happy birthday. When was the birthday?
It was yesterday, 15th.
And how was that celebrated?
Well, following on from your recent podcast, I watched Jaws with a couple of...
Hey! Great! Isn't it good?
It was, and this time I watched it not as a shark movie, but as a... I just watched the relationship between the three fellas on the boat.
There you go.
And I watched out for the Popeye character as well, coming out of the harbour.
Did you see him?
Good.
You saw him?
It's the first time I've noticed it, actually.
Hey,
Yes.
that's great.
So we're performing a valuable service in our film club.
We must keep it going. Fantastic.
I'm glad you
So, Nick,
enjoyed it.
have you got it's the tradition with our birthday guests that they have a conversational log to chuck on the fire. Have you got any proposition you want to head our way?
Well, yeah, I'm scrolling through YouTube watching bands and things, and very often it's people say this act or this band or this artist was underrated, and I sort of feel that the term underrated is somewhat overrated.
Definitely. Listen, I've applied a lot of thought to this over the years, and the use of underrated as an adjective indicating, favourable, indicating I like something, was coined entirely by middle-aged men. It's nobody else.
Middle-aged rock critics mostly.
Well, no, or would-be rock critics. It's just a thing that blokes say. Blokes don't say, do you know, I like so-and-so. They don't do that at all. Blokes say, no, it's really underrated, actually. Because the implication is, I've spotted something here that other people haven't spotted. Because what they like is the idea that their definition of popularity is slightly elite. It's not the same popularity as everybody else has, and so they will seize on the words underrated. People will still say to me, Nick Drake is underrated. I think that's preposterous.
It's preposterous. Nobody could possibly have been more rated.
It's highly rated.
But I think also that it's a male-female thing. Is that by saying something's underrated, it means that you, nearly always a man, care about what the consensus opinion is. And you care about where that positions you as regards that consensus opinion. Dave and I have always said this, but working in offices, we always noticed that men would always say, what's this that was playing? And then you tell them and go, oh, yeah, I quite like it, or I don't like it. And they wouldn't say what they thought of it until they found out what it was, in case they said the wrong thing. Whereas girls would say, this is great. What is it?
It
didn't matter to them at all whether that, the consensus thought it was a good idea.
Yeah. It's never going to go away. It's one of the most widely used ways of telling people that you like something, and because it implies that everybody else is thick and cloth-eared and you're not. And I do occasionally think of things that are actually underrated, but even they get kind of taken up. And, like you might have said 15 years ago that ELO were underrated. Now you'd be forced to say they're not underrated anymore. Everybody's just caught up with that, There's the occasional act that is just sort of uncelebrated. Nobody writes a long piece in Mojo about how great they are, which eventually all acts will have a long piece in Mojo saying how great they were and how they were underrated. And, and there'll eventually be a box set of all their outtakes. It'll apply to absolutely all acts eventually. So there's just one of those things that we're stuck with, I'm afraid. Who do you think, Nick, is underrated?
Well, actually, I don't. And in a strange backhanded way, when you mentioned earlier, a few months ago, Love's Forever Changes, you sort of validated my point of view. For a long time, people were saying Love Forever Changes, classic album. And listened to it and thought, faint praise, damning and all. I said, it's all right. But from a personal taste point of view, it's just not my thing. But then I suppose, and again, we're in the realms of cliches and things. You talked about ELO. Well, my dad had it Out of the Blue. We also had, when I was growing up, the Carpenters' Greatest Hits. In fact, both of them. And then over the years, it's kind of dawned upon people the Carpenters actually were, quite good, really. But then it's a bit begrudging anyway, because people will sort of say, but it was kind of down to those production values that Richard brought to the table, rather than just saying, they made good songs. Karen had a brilliant voice, and would
it have been a man saying that or a woman? I think you'll find it was to do with Richard's production values brought to the table.
No, it's true. It's true. Everything gets rated eventually, I suppose, and that's quite right and only fair, I suppose, eventually. So, well, look, thanks very much for your support, and turn your birthday celebrations into an entire weekend. You have our permission.
Thank you. Yeah.
Watch all the Jaws movies.
Yeah. Watch Jaws 2.
Don't watch Jaws 4 with Michael Caine.
No. So that's about it. That's about it from us this week, isn't it? And as we got to all say goodbye. Goodbye from me. Goodbye from Mark. Say goodbye, Mark.
Goodbye, all.
Goodbye, Alex. Say goodbye, Alex.
Bye, Alex.
Goodbye, Nick.
Goodbye.
This podcast was brought to you by The Word.